Hi, I'm Moaj Lally, President of Mindful Leader, and your host for the Mindfulness at Work Summit. For this session, we'll be talking to Sharon Salzberg. Sharon Salzberg is a central figure in the field of meditation, a world-renowned teacher and New York Times bestselling author. She's played a critical role in bringing meditation and mindfulness practices to the West and making mainstream culture since 1974 when she first began teaching. She is the co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society and the author of 10 books, including New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, her seminal work, Loving Kindness, and her newest book, Real Love. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you.
So excited to have you part of this. And I've shared with you before, your book, Loving Kindness, had a really deep impact on me very early on my journey. So this is really exciting for me to have this conversation. And really excited to explore this idea of love in the workplace. But before we get started, can you give our audience a sense when we talk about love, what that means? That's such a loaded word. And when I think about it, I think of that song, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me.
Uh,
So,
it's a loaded term. It's so difficult. I mean, we think of love, we think of affection and romance and commitment or heartbreak or, longing. I actually tend to define love as much as one can define it as very similar to loving kindness in the Buddhist tradition. And that is a profound sense of connection. It's recognizing ourselves in one another. It's realizing our lives have something to do with one another. It doesn't mean you like somebody, oddly enough. Um, when I was working on Real Love, I was often meeting with groups of people just to hear their stories and their insights and so on about love. And the last group I did was actually in Barre, Massachusetts, where the Insight Meditation Society is, and is a local community and people who work on staff at IMS. And so we gathered together and we're just talking about love. And this one man said to me, my whole life I thought that liking somebody is like the ordinary thing. It's the expected thing. Of course you like everybody, but loving somebody, that is so rare. That's so really, really rare. And he said to me, you're reversing it. You're saying we can love everybody, maybe not like many people at all. And I thought about it and I said, you're right, I am. Isn't that odd? I hadn't really thought about it that way. Because I'm not talking about approving of somebody or championing their point of view or, hoping they'll succeed even. But it's that bone deep recognition that, the construct of self and other and us and them that can be a useful construct is still just a construct. The level of reality where we is very vibrant and alive, although often covered over.
and I'm curious, so just to play with that a little bit, so say that, not going to pick on any politician out there, but I could love a certain politician, but not like them. And just to draw that distinction out a little more, there's a sense of recognizing sort of the connection of us to each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to approve of what that individual might be doing,
Mm-hmm.
or even like them.
No, definitely. I try all the time to separate the heart space of loving kindness or compassion from the action that then follows. What we do, what we refrain from doing, which is its own kind of action, what we say, what we refrain from saying. Because when we morph those two, like the heart space of loving kindness and a certain action, then we're stuck, right? We feel imprisoned by the love. Like I can only say yes. I can only approve. I can only give them money. I can only let them do it again, whatever it is, and that may not be true at all. We know there's such a thing as tough love. There's such a thing as fierce compassion, maybe out of a very loving motivation. You also bring in discernment and understanding and past experience and skills training and all kinds of things into what you do or what you say. Do you say yes? Do you say no? I don't know. It's very contextual. There's not like a formula that love equals yes, it's really contextual. What is that moment revealing to you? That's the decision point.
And I'm curious why. Uh, there just seems to be just a certain reaction through society towards love, and even the meditation and mindfulness community. Um, it's kind of funny when I say this, but it just feels like compassion and love is like the next thing. Like now it's starting to
Yeah.
kind of catch on, and people are talking about it more and more. And so, curious, why the timing of this book now, and of this focus on love?
Well, in a way, it's always been my focus. My first book, Loving Kindness, came out in 1995. And it's really like a manual for that particular methodology of meditation. It is its own method. It's very tied in with mindfulness. And I'm not sure you can really do mindfulness without some measure of loving kindness, because all these things about, say, your emotional landscape and your intentions and thought patterns are going to get revealed. And how are you going to hold them? You know, is there a lot of self-hatred? Is there a lot of judgment? Are you being fair to yourself? You know, can you have compassion for yourself rather than such a sense of failure? You know, if things go awry, things like that. So I think it's really in there, but it also exists as its own method. And I began teaching in the Loving Kindness in the West in 1985 when I got back from Burma, where I'd gone for 3 months. And I was the only Westerner I knew teaching loving kindness. And there was a lot of pushback from within the Buddhist community, you know, like, well, that's just a feel good practice and you're not going to really get to wisdom that way. And, but I just knew what it had done for me. And so I kept teaching it. And now there's, I think, a much greater appreciation that it's not that easy to be mindful, really. You know, you say, "Oh, be with your experience without judging." Well, how? You know, like I'm very judgmental. You know, I really don't like myself. I have all these patterns of avoidance, and you know, it's hard to sit sometimes and be with your own experience directly. And so we need almost like that holding environment, that kind of um, really, it's like a landscape with of care and compassion and so on that we can meet all of our experience with. So it's really important.
And in your book, you start by exploring this idea of self-love, and that might not be the best way to describe it, but sort of focusing inward and loving yourself, and then kind of going from there. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that, and why to start that way?
Yeah. I'm actually going to go back to the first part of your other question too, which is that love is also often thought of as a weakness. Like you lose common sense, you lose your edge, you can't strive for excellence, you're just kind of gooey, you know, and like pretentious and hypocritical. And but really, I think as we explore it, as we explore the quality, we see it's a tremendous strength. It's a force. It's not the same as being meek or people pleasing or something like that. And so that takes some direct exploration. And part of the problem with loving oneself is that it also falls into this miscategorization or misunderstanding, like that's the same as narcissism, that's being self-centered, that's being selfish. But really, I think it's just being balanced, you know, like for one thing, all the time we spend looking at our faults and what we didn't do right and what we could have done better. You know, could we give a little bit of airtime to caring about ourselves? And you know, and the other part of it is self-compassion. Like, what about when we do make a mistake? You know, we have this huge aspiration and we lose sight of it, or we fall down in some way, and we have to pick ourselves up or let others help us up and go forward again. You know, we're always needing to begin again, and we need resilience, and we need some sense of inner wherewithal or resource so that we can get up again and start over. And we must do that a billion times a day, right? And so where's that coming from? You know, if we feel depleted, we feel overcome, we feel shattered, it's all too much. We don't really kind of celebrate the potential we have for goodness, for understanding. It's going to be very hard in times of stress or so on. Whereas if we have some sense of inner resource, we relate differently. And we know that, right? It's like if you're exhausted, you didn't sleep, and you know you're just so tired, and somebody makes some comment and you blow up, compared to you had a perfect night's sleep and you had a lovely morning with your family, and then somebody makes that same comment and you laugh it off. right? It's not a different comment, but we're receiving it differently. So there's a lot of power in that, actually. How are we receiving what's going on, and can we make something of it? And so we need some sense of inner abundance, or at least inner sufficiency, in order to meet the adversity of life.
And as you were sharing that, the thought that came up for me is just how much it complements deep meditation. I was just thinking about an experience I had, long retreat, where I looked at myself. I was like, "Oh my God, I'm a horrible person! I'm such a greedy asshole." And so just to be able to kind of explore ourselves and the things that come up, it could really help balance and provide a little safety and comfort in that.
And it's true, because it's not the same as being conflict avoidant or trying to pretend I'm perfect, or it's something very different than that.
And I want to explore how this all relates to the workplace, and there's a couple of things that came up as I was doing a little bit of research of this idea of love in the workplace, and you mentioned in your book it's also this idea of authentic connection, and so how does that all come together? And one of the studies that I found really fascinating was Google did this 2-year study where they explored what makes a high-performing team run, and what they discovered was a psychologically safe workplace. And so this idea of authentic connection, and how love might work in just a team or sort of cultural capacity. I'm curious if you could talk to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, a few years ago, I wrote a book called Real Happiness at Work. And the research I did at the time said that one of the strongest sources of happiness at work was a sense of meaning. And a sense of meaning is something we often have to infuse into the job description. It may not be there all on its own. And where does that come from? It comes from connecting differently to people. If you have a personal resolve, say, every person I encounter today, I will make the effort to listen compassionately. That's infusing your work with a sense of meaning, even if it's kind of drudgery in other ways. And I was once part of this project through this place called the Garrison Institute in Garrison, New York, where it was like a 4-year project where we brought tools like yoga and meditation to frontline domestic violence shelter workers, and ultimately directors and supervisors of shelters. And it was really a fantastic opportunity, to be looking at these things. And we would always begin by giving someone either a piece of paper or just having them do this as a reflection. And in one column, we would say, write down what the greatest sources of stress at work are for you. And that was often surprising. It wasn't even like the seemingly intractable suffering they were facing every day or the brutality. But it was bad communication with coworkers. It was bad relationship with the supervisor. It was very immediate. A lot about communication and feeling alone instead of part of a team, and so on. And then just to continue on with that model. In the second column, we would say, write down the things you do to lift your spirits, to be resilient, to get a break, to relax. And I think in 4 years, everybody wrote down some kind of music. I listened to music. There was all kinds of different music. And of course, you didn't have to disclose what you wrote either, but some people had a strong faith-based tradition, and they talked about that. Some people said, I get out in nature. It really helps me so much. Some people said, I drink a lot, something like that. And then in the third column, we asked them to look back at that second column, at the things they do to pick themselves up. And we said, how do you feel about what you wrote down? So like the people who wrote down, I drink a lot, would often say, I'm troubled by that. I'm worried about that. Sometimes the people who went out into nature would say, it helps me so much. I haven't done it in 7 years, but it really helps me a lot. I should do it more. And then we would talk about yoga and meditation. Well, here's some tools if you want to experiment with adding these to that ability to bounce back, to be resilient, and so on. And it's not a solitary, it's a person's effort. It's a single person's effort, but it changes the environment in which everyone is working together. So it becomes a kind of collective experience.
And so you mentioned this having purpose, but then now this sense of belonging, and you mentioned loneliness. And one of the focuses, the former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, did an article with Harvard Business Review talking about work and the loneliness epidemic. I mean, that's how bad it's getting. And so if people are able to show up and kind of you have this culture of authentic connection, that could make quite a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of times we know all these things are good, but we don't know how to get there, right? So I'm guilty of this too, where I've been in situations where I'm talking to someone and I'll kind of act like I care, and I'll sort of ask them a question and sort of nod my head and wait for them to get done. I'll say, okay, now go do this. And so to really bring a real sense of compassion and really without having to say anything, just the way that you show up, how do people cultivate that so that's just natural and sort of has that vibe and that presence?
I think it's all about attention. And we know we can change the way we pay attention. We can cultivate different kinds of attention because that's basically what meditation practice is. And because that's my way, the way I'm most familiar with, I think about cultivating different sorts of attention, and I think of meditation right away, which of course we have to do and not just think about. But I think it really is about attention. It's like if you're in a conversation with somebody and you're not really listening to them, you're not really looking at them, and you're thinking about the email you need to send, you're thinking about who else you'd rather be talking to. There's no chance for connection, right? And yet, if you realize that, you can do exactly what we do in the meditative process, which is gently let go of the distraction and return. Then you're fully there. It may only last a moment and you have to do it again, but you know what to do, right? So the first question is, what do we pay attention to? Like, how are we paying? Are we there? Are we there? Are we fragmented? Are we even present? And then, are we consumed with looking for what's negative, like in ourselves, for example, at the end of a workday? Can we give a little airtime to wishing ourselves well, or almost asking ourselves, like, anything else happened today? Just to balance out that picture. And there's a very crucial question of who do we pay attention to? Who do we ignore? Who doesn't count? Who do we objectify? Who is the other for us, even by dint of indifference, not even bias of some kind. So one of my favorite questions to ask if I go into a workplace to do a teaching or training, I say, how many other people need to be doing their job well for you to be able to do your job well? Because we think, there's the surgeon. We don't think necessarily there's a housekeeper who's keeping that operating theater sterile, thank goodness, right? And we're all counting on all these people, all these conditions coming together. When I think about how many times I've counted on an airplane to be on time, never is, but, and I think, well, I needed this and this and this and this and this to happen. I needed that driver to get me there. It's a complex system, that's all interconnected and intertwined. And it's possible to have that perspective about things. And that's the natural doorway to compassion.
And I'm curious to explore just these practices that might help people develop compassion. And I know that you talk about love not being a commodity, but something that an ability we could cultivate. And I feel like that's just so jarring for some folks, because you sort of feel like love is something you give and someone takes, and again back to sort of all the heartbreak and all the hurt around that. But if it's an ability, that changes the whole thing.
Yeah, that was actually the one sentence, which was a line in a movie, which gave birth to my most recent book, Real Love. Is a movie called Dan in Real Life. It's about 11 years old, I think. And my goddaughter had a part in it, which is, which is great. And she was a really little girl then, but she's not anymore. Anyway, so the line in the movie is, Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. Love is not a feeling, it's an ability. And I actually had some discussion with one of my editors who said, of course it's a feeling. You can't say that, it's a feeling we all want and we yearn for. And I said, okay, you can say it's a feeling. Of course, we know that. That's the conventional understanding. But what if we thought of it as an ability? If we think of it as a commodity or something external to us, then it's in someone else's hands. Like they can deliver it to us or they can take it away from us. And if they take it away from us, we have nothing. We're just depleted or bereft. And if we think of it as an ability, then it's ours. It's inside us. And other people certainly might threaten it or enhance it, but it's ours ultimately. So I used to get this image, and that made total sense to me when I heard that line, because it resonated with my meditation experience also. I realized I used to think of love as like a package, and the UPS person, I would just get this image of them standing on my doorstep, and they'd glance down at the address, and they'd say, no, I feel like going somewhere else. And you go, wait a minute, that I've got nothing. So it's a very different feeling of empowerment when we think of it as an ability inside of us, but it's also a different feeling of responsibility. It's like if you want love in a conversation, maybe you have to be the one to bring it there, or in a workplace, or a project, or whatever it is. It may be up to us.
And so looking at love as an ability, and sort of trying to give people the tools and ways to cultivate or practice it, how do people get started? Like what does this look like as far as the different meta practices and things that are out there?
I think you can do it several ways. Obviously, you can formally undertake a loving kindness practice, which I can describe. You can also just do the kind of mindfulness meditation, like a breath meditation, and beginning really with loving kindness for yourself. Notice how you speak to yourself when you become distracted. Because inevitably, let's say you're trying to center your attention on the feeling of the breath. It's not going to be 9,000 breaths before your mind wanders. It's going to be 2 or 1, and then you're gone, and then you realize that. So that's considered the critical moment after you've been distracted. When you're kind of waking up to it, can you let go gently, or do you have to berate yourself for an hour and a half? Can you come back, and start over? Just rest your attention on the breath, or do you have to go on and declare yourself a failure? And so that moment is a sneaky kind of way of practicing love, certainly for oneself, upon which we then build. Or you can do a formal loving kindness practice.
And walk us through, what does a formal loving kindness practice look like?
Do you want to actually do some? So do it as a meditation? Or?
That'd be fun, yeah.
Okay. So you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not, depending on what you're used to, how you feel most comfortable. Just let your energy sink into your body. And see if there's certain phrases, 2 or 3 phrases, maybe 4, that come up for you that reflect the gift you would like to give yourself. This is a practice of generosity of the spirit. It's gift giving, it's offering, it's blessing. Phrases like, may I be safe, or feel safe. May I be happy. May I be peaceful. Even if the words don't seem perfect, it's okay. They're serving us, they're carrying the energy of the heart. So 3 or 4 phrases, and the first recipient is yourself. You gently repeat the phrases over and over again with enough space, enough silence, so that it's a rhythm that's pleasing to you. May I be safe. Be happy. Be peaceful. May I be safe. Be happy. Be peaceful. And here too, as you find your attention wanders and you go to the past or you go to the future, see if you can just gently let go once you realize it and return your attention to the phrases for yourself. And think of someone who's helped you in some way. They've been like a mentor to you, a teacher for you, an inspiration. Maybe you've never met them. And if someone like that comes to mind, see if you can get an image of them or say their name to yourself. Get a feeling for their presence and offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. Again, even if the words aren't perfect, it's okay. It's the vehicle for the gift giving. May you be safe, be happy, be peaceful. I think of someone you know who's struggling in some way, having a difficult time right now. See what happens as you offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. And we'll close with a kind of global expansion to all beings everywhere, all people, all creatures, all those in existence, near and far, known and unknown. May all beings be safe, be happy, be peaceful. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes.
Wow, that was nice.
It was a nice interlude in the middle of the day, wasn't it?
And I'm curious, I know I've done similar practices before, and sometimes then the attention will go to someone sort of neutral, and then maybe someone that I might have a little friction with.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess and I always have a hard time when it gets to the person I have friction with. Like, always have such a hard time there. And I'm curious, how how can people use this practice, and how do they sort of build up in it?
Well, there is a kind of classical sequence. We didn't do all of it because it was so short. And I don't think you can really do all of it in any one session. That seems pretty quick to me.
Mm.
The classical sequence, which by the way is meant to be based on the principle that it's good to do it in the easiest way possible, which is also confounding for many of us who tend to complexify things, but the easiest way possible. So you start with yourself, because I mean, this is an ancient time. I guess, it was easiest to offer loving kindness to yourself. Many people these days would say it's the hardest. But in terms of just the classical sequence, you start with yourself. We say go back to the principle, like do it, experiment, figure out what sequence is right for you. So it's fine if you mix it up. But originally, you start with yourself, you'd go on to a benefactor, someone who's helped you, and then a friend, and then a neutral person, someone you don't really know that well. Maybe it's someone um, who plays some function in your life you see now and then, something like that. And then someone you have some difficulty with. But here too, in that principle of doing it the easiest way possible, they say don't start with the most like unthinkable person who has hurt you so badly, or in your view is behaving so despicably on the world stage. It's just unbelievable. It's unimaginable. Like, don't start there. Start with someone you have a little bit of friction with, or a little bit of annoyance. And it's almost like muscle strength. You're building it up. And you're also building an embodied understanding that you may not ever have clear words for, but it's a felt sense of what it could mean, for example, to have loving kindness for someone else and for yourself. So you're not just giving up your principles and your values and, your need to be happy too, right? But it's some mix there. What does it feel like? And what does it feel like to have compassion, say, for somebody and realize I can't fix this? I can't make their choices for them or make up their minds for them. This is out of my hands. I'll do what I can, and there needs to be a kind of letting go. Or what does it feel like to have compassion for someone and realize I disagree so completely with your agenda and your desires that I'm just going to fight as hard as I can, but it doesn't have to be coming from a place of hatred. So these are very thorny questions of life, and like I said, you may not have a clear wording for it, clear articulation, but you get this embodied knowledge. So if you start with someone who's kind of a little bit annoying and you slowly make your way over, you've kind of done the strength training to offer loving kindness to someone more difficult. And then we move on from the difficult person to all beings everywhere, to that kind of global expanse. So what we sometimes say for daily sitting is see if you can start with yourself and end with all beings. And then maybe you have time for one other person. Maybe your daughter's graduating from high school, so that's your daughter's day, or you have a friend going into surgery, it's their day, or whatever it is.
And I'm curious, when someone might work this into their meditation practice, and my initial exposure to meditation was through the Goenka tradition, and there was sort of a very clear, structured sort of a way of doing things. Where can someone, should they start with, kind of focus attention and then work in metta, or is there a way that you would suggest that people practice this within their...
I would just keep exploring, For many people, it's exactly the sequence you just described. You start with something like the breath and body awareness and maybe walking meditation. And then after some time, you might be experimenting with also doing loving kindness. So it isn't necessarily replacing one with the other, but although it could be, but it's more likely having more than one practice. That maybe you do different times of day or whatever, or you join in one session. Um, for some people, though, since I started teaching loving kindness retreats, no, way back in '85, it just didn't occur to me at the time that I needed to put a prerequisite on those retreats and say, well, come if you've already done, 7 days of mindfulness or something like that. Or um, it never occurred to me. And so all of a sudden there was a whole new uh, kind of meditator, which was a person starting with loving kindness. And so that's been all these years, that there's some people who start with loving kindness. And it's really up to you. And it is like an experiment. It's an exploration. For some people, loving kindness is actually easier. There's a way to channel mental energy, like through those phrases. It's very relational. If you come from a strong faith tradition, it's resonant with that, love thy neighbor and all that. And or one's humanistic values, may be very aligned. For some people, it's not that easy. So it doesn't really work as an initial meditation. But for others, I've been so surprised, to see that, for one thing, it's so easy in meditation anyway to fall into this kind of sleepy, dreamy, drifty state. And I call it the ooze. You're just kind of oozing along. And with the breath, you might ooze along for a good long time before you notice that. Whereas, because you're saying phrases in loving kindness, silently saying phrases, and those phrases mean something, what usually happens if you get really sluggish in the meditation is that the phrases become garbled. And so that's a pretty quick feedback system. So, for example, sometimes in Burma, when I went in '85, I would hear myself repeating, may you be filled with suffering, may you be filled with suffering. I go, no, may you be free of suffering. That's the phrase. But I'd see it so quickly because of that mistake that I could bring myself into a greater balance much more quickly.
And two things came up. One I wanted to share with you. I once was at a retreat where I had a teacher suggested me to do loving kindness, but with a body scan. And I was like, I didn't even know you could do that. That was really cool. Like just kind of mixing them together.
Yeah.
And another thing, I remember once I was working in a really, really hostile, difficult environment, and I drive to work and I had a set of rosaries, and I do kind of loving kindness as I was driving and just kind of keep track. And it helped me really just survive because it was a real tough environment.
That's great. The first, that's also in my book, Real Love, coincidentally. It was 1993 or maybe 1994. I was working on my book, Real Loving Kindness, which was my first book. And I didn't have my own computer. In those days, I knew hardly anybody who did. And one thing I noticed was that the people who did, my friends who did, never talked about anything else but their computers. I was like, what is going on? And I was totally intimidated. I thought I could never learn how to use a thing like that. It's way beyond me. And in those days, for you younger people, cutting and pasting meant getting a pair of scissors and cutting out the paragraph you wanted to move, and you move it up and down, you figure out where you want it to go, and you get a roll of Scotch tape and you tape it there. So that's what editing meant. So it was really slow going. And one day we got a message at the Insight Meditation Society that this 94-year-old monk from Sri Lanka was going to come visit, this monk named Ananda Maitreya. So he's 94 years old. We're sitting up in one of the rooms and just having a chat. And he mentioned he was going to learn how to use a computer. So I thought, okay, he's 94. He's going to learn how to use a computer. I guess I can too. Then he said he wanted to give a talk in the hall, in the meditation hall. So we had a retreat that was ongoing. So I thought, okay, he's 94. It's not going to be a very long talk. So we gathered everybody into the hall, and it was an endless talk, just endless. Um, he had so much energy. He had more energy than all of us put together. And he said in the course of the talk, I want to teach you my favorite meditation. And that was the combination of loving kindness and a body scan. So he'd like sweep his attention through his body with loving kindness, like, may my head be happy, may my ears be happy, may my nose, and you just kind of go down. And I thought, wow, maybe that's why he has so much energy. It's such a beneficent sense of one's body. And that's a very powerful practice. I've, taught it people with disease, obviously, and scarring and, all kinds of things. And what is that allows us to hold that differently? So there isn't the rejection, the condemnation, and the disgust or whatever we might feel, but there is a real kind of tenderness and compassion. It's kind of an amazing practice.
And people could do this possibly on their way to work. They could do it open-eyed. They could use rosaries, external aids. It just sounds like there's many ways to go about it.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to bring things back to sort of the benefits of doing this. So if someone does this, if someone practices this, what might they expect in the way that they show up with their family in the workplace?
Well, I think one sees pretty quickly if you're distracted, for example, and you have developed that ability to very gracefully come back. That's a huge thing, for all the time, say you're with your family or you're in the workplace and you're not really there. I think we get so sensitive to the thoughts and feelings that we're having that, for one thing, we can see the kind of assumptions that come up in our minds. You know how it is if you have a kind of hidden assumption or unconscious bias and you don't even realize it. And then you're just operating from that place because you don't realize it. It's like when somebody has a very fixed idea about a resolution to a problem and you sit in those meetings and maybe 50 other resolutions come up, but none of them is good enough because it's not the one thing, because it's just that fixation. So you get, I think, so familiar with your own mind, you can see the assumption coming, realize it's just an assumption, and you just want to wait. Does this test out actually? What is this? I also tell the story in my book, In Real Love, about a friend of mine who was a writer, and he went on a book tour, and he gave a lecture somewhere. And in the course of the lecture, he mentioned that when he'd been a younger person, reading Proust had been very important to him, especially remembrances of things past. So he just mentioned that in the lecture, and then he gave the lecture. He went out to dinner afterwards. He was in some restaurant, and this group of people approached him, and this woman stepped out of the group, and he just took a look at her, and he thought, well, she doesn't look really smart. She looks really uneducated, And she came up to him and she said, I was at your lecture, so his heart sank. He thought, what's she going to say? And then she said, I really liked your talk. I just want to say that for me, I get so much more out of reading Proust in the original French. And I was like, okay, what visions are we holding of one another, and how much of it is just, constructed out of nothing? It's not always constructed out of nothing, but we don't usually look, to see. And so the more aware you get, the more you see your assumptions and you can test them out. The more flexibility you have, the ability to let go, much more resilience, the ability to start over. There are many kinds of benefits that come.
And I know a lot of these benefits are similar to other techniques of meditation. I wonder with metta if there's loving kindness, if there's sort of a distinction. And I know a lot of the new research coming out, they're looking more and more at loving kindness. And for me, I just wonder maybe there might be some effect on just emotional capacity to just sort of deal with kind of stronger kind of emotional capacity.
Sure. I mean, I don't know what the research is going to show because the research is also clumsy, in terms of how we can measure and, what we measure and so on. And they would be the first to say that, the scientists. And so, I mean, that, classically it was taught that loving kindness is the antidote to fear. And I think in practical terms, it checks out, if you've been governed by fear or governed by resentment, and you do loving kindness, you find both those kinds of qualities fading some and more and more. And you find that you're making choices more out of a sense of connection, and caring. It still could be strong choices, like strong boundaries or something like that, but it's coming from a very different place inside. And so we're motivated differently. We have a different sense of being part of a team. I think those are pretty strong features of loving kindness.
And I wonder if there's also this sense of generosity, sort of the givingness. And then often in business, they talk about the sense of abundance for scarcity. And so that could definitely come into play as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Well, I know we're coming to a close here. There's just one quote that everyone knows that I wanted to share that just was ringing in my head as we were prepping for this session. And that's the old Machiavellian quote, better to be feared than loved. That has really, a lot of, and there was a point in my life that I sort of attached myself to that style. And it feels like now we're coming to a point that just doesn't work anymore. And that's great.
Right. Probably never worked, really,
well, True.
I mean, there are some features of our time, like loneliness, which seems to be an epidemic, that do call for a new look. What are the things we've been taught make us strong? Vindictiveness will make us strong. Vengefulness, but really, let's take a look. What are the things we're taught will make us weak? Generosity, vulnerability, compassion. But really, let's take a look. And it's a very empowering process to really look and see. Look at all these myths I've been fed and the lies I've been told and that we all are told. And one of my favorite stories these days is I once kind of temporarily almost ruined this young woman's life because I was co-teaching this 6-day program. And the first night I used the phrase, it's a dog eat dog world. And how, many of us are kind of brought up on that ethic, like don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And you're on your own, doesn't matter who you have to step on your way up, because no one's going to help you. It's a dog eat dog world. And the more you can put other people down, the better you'll feel. So this woman was like completely shocked and she came up to the microphone and she said, I never knew the phrase was, it's a dog eat dog world. I always thought the phrase was, it's a doggy dog world, like D-O-G-G-Y, D-O-G, like puppies jumping up and down in meadows, So what a horrible phrase. So the 6 days went on and there was a closing circle the last morning. And she came up to the microphone and she said, I refuse to live in a dog-eat-dog world. I'm going to live in a dog-eat-dog world. And you could say fairly enough that a lot of businesses, your competitors are living in a dog-eat-dog world. But in the end, you also have to think about not only your own satisfaction and fulfillment as a human being, but what actually works. And I think it's a surprising answer.
Wow. I think that's a great note to wrap our session up on. And for the audience that might want to connect more and learn more, I know the book's out there everywhere, so they could find it bookstores, Amazon, and everywhere. But if they wanted to engage you more, what's the best way to go about doing that?
It's really just my website at SharonSalzberg.com.
Excellent. Well, Sharon, really appreciate the time together and for you being part of this. This has been really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to a close. I'm Mo Ejlali, your host for the Mindfulness at Work Summit. Thanks for joining us.